It's been a little while since we have followed up with another entry in our series of videos calling out fake quotes that are widely shared on the internet, often uncritically. And we've done several other Stoic authors. It's about time that we get to the most prolific Stoic author that we have, and that is Seneca. There's a lot of fake quotes that people will uncritically share, even on Stoicism sites. So let's start with the first and most egregious one. Religion is regarded by the common people as true, by the wise as false, and by rulers as useful. And you notice that this one is coming directly from thestoicism.com, who clearly didn't bother to source their quotes or check on any of them. And is this by Seneca? No. As a matter of fact, this very cynical observation, which, by the way, Cicero has a character say something like this On the Nature of the Gods, is actually coming from Edward Gibbon, a much, much later author who wrote the various modes of worship which prevailed in the Roman world were all considered by the people as equally true, by the philosophers equally false, and by the magistrate as equally useful. So you can see that people are actually reducing the equally out of there into this condensed quote. This is from the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which, by the way, not very good history at all. A little bit later on, researching it, Albert Hubbard would claim in Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Philosophers that Gibbon was making a, quote, free translation from Seneca. And free translation there should be understood as putting anything he wanted into Seneca's mouth. This second fake quote is a very popular one, especially among business types, and you notice that this one is actually coming from what should be viewed as a typically reputable website, the IAI, right? And they didn't bother to check their quotes. You know, a lot of these institutions have budgets where they could easily hire a fact checker before they put things out there. Did Seneca say nothing remotely like this? No, Seneca actually does talk about the need for preparation. He doesn't use opportunity quite so much. You know, it's more common to think in terms of like the appropriate time among the ancients. But he does talk about a wrestler who has trained and prepared and those sorts of things. But there's nothing about luck in there. So it looks like the oldest instance of a quote like this might be from the early 1900s in Youth's Companion. He is lucky who realizes that luck is the point where preparation meets opportunity. And it's attributed to other people as well. It gets passed around and shared, and now I think they just tack Seneca's name onto it basically to have some sort of prestige associated with the saying. Another very popular quote that you'll see, there's no right way to do the wrong thing or a wrong thing. There's variations of this out there, and really the first attestation of this looks like it's from 1850 in an article about Britain and India, published in Debau's Southern and Western Review, criticizing Britain's treatment of India and writing, there's no right way of doing a wrong thing. While the relation itself is allowed to continue, the mode of acting under this relation must partake of its vicious and unnatural character. And then we see it getting reprinted here and there, particularly in newspapers. The Negro Star in 1947, a set of wise sayings. And then 1955, it gets credited to the philosopher Seneca in a Louisiana newspaper. Who knows where this is actually coming from originally, you know, in terms of the attribution to Seneca? Was it something that the Louisiana newspaper writer had seen somebody else attribute? We don't know. But it's clearly from the 1900s. This quote, "We are waves of the same sea, leaves of the same tree, flowers of the same garden," sounds very nice, doesn't it? It is not from Seneca at all, although interestingly, there's a little bit of a backstory there about monuments in Italy that are supposed to be a message of fraternity in the province of Verona. These are supposed to be inspired by the philosopher Seneca, but in point of fact, we know exactly where this comes from. It is from the founder of the Baha'i faith in the 19th century, Baha'u'llah, recorded in his promulgation of universal peace. So this one is pretty easy to identify as definitively not being from Seneca, even though it's constantly getting attributed to him. This next one is kind of an interesting one because it's not totally off base. Seneca says something kind of like this, but he doesn't say this specifically. And notice who is putting this quote out there. Franklin Covey, right? The company of Stephen Covey. And he put this actually out in his Twitter, again, without checking his sources, without hiring somebody to do the basic fact checking that would be so easy to do. Anger is an acid that can do more harm to the vessel in which it is stored than to anything on which it is poured. This is a common statement made by a lot of people. It's also attributed to Mark Twain. It appears in the American Mercury, volume 92, and word for word like that. It's also attributed to the Baptist Beacon, which is another publication. Now, did Seneca say something kind of like this? Yes, but Seneca doesn't talk about acid. He talks about poison. Right? Evil herself drinks the largest portion of her own poison. Poison is kind of like acid, but not exactly the same. And so we have to call this a fake quote, and people should probably not be attributing this one to Seneca anymore. Now we get one that's very interesting because people who share this almost never share just the English. It's somehow very attractive to share the Latin, perhaps to show their erudition or to establish some kind of bona fide. And so let's actually read the Latin. Errare humanum est, perseverare autem diabolicum. To err is human, but to persist in error is diabolical. Is this by Seneca? No, it's not by Seneca. Who we do see saying things like this before Seneca and after Seneca. Cicero says something like this, right? And Augustine of Hippo says something like this as well. And then we see something much later with Alexander Pope's essay on criticism, where he says, to err is human, to forgive divine. Now, it would kind of make sense to talk about diabolical for Augustine. Augustine is a Christian author. It could even make sense for some pagan authors in late antiquity as well. It really wouldn't make sense for Cicero or for Seneca to be talking about that, although they both, would say persevering, persisting in error, that is indeed a problem. So the attributing this to diabolical influences, that's more of a early Christianity, late antiquity sort of thing. This next one, he who spares the wicked injures the good, a decent sentiment, a interesting proverb, but it's not by Seneca. Rather, it is from Publilius Syrus. And we see similar things said by somebody like Cicero in On Duties. But the point of fact of this is that it doesn't come from Seneca. It does come from another identifiable author. So we probably shouldn't be attributing it to Seneca himself. Here's a very interesting proposition. Love in its essence is spiritual fire. Now, if you know anything about ancient culture, if you know anything about the vocabulary, the concepts that they would be using, you can say right off the bat, this is not only not from Seneca, it's not from any ancient Greek or Latin author. These are some pretty modern ideas. Maybe you could find some of them in the Middle Ages as well. Love being a spiritual fire. Yeah, that's not going to be in somebody like Seneca. Who is it from? Emanuel Swedenborg, who, is kind of a mystic and a very popular writer. And this is rather a, let's call it, early romantic sentiment, not something Seneca himself would say. Here's another that you see used quite often and attributed to Seneca. Every sin is the result of a collaboration. We know who this comes from. It's Stephen Crane in The Blue Hotel, not from Seneca at all. And I'm not sure at all of the backstory of how this got attributed to Seneca himself, but we know that it's not by him. I've saved what, in certain respects, is the best for last. Throw me to the wolves and I will return leading the pack. So it's not clear where this came from, but this is clearly like a 20th or 21st century sort of thing to say, full of bravado, not remotely what somebody who practices Stoicism would think to themselves, let alone say to other people. But it is the kind of, Stoic bro type of sentiment that you do see circulated around quite a bit by people who don't understand Stoicism, but think that it's all about toughness. The idea of throwing somebody to the wolves, do you really think you're going to have a Latin author talking about that? I mean, Seneca does talk about throwing somebody to lampreys or eels to feast on them, saying that this is a horrible thing that somebody is doing and is punished by the Emperor Augustus for on anger. But where would you be throwing somebody to the wolves? This is a much later saying and sentiment, and so definitely not by Seneca. No idea who actually coined this, but this falls under the province of silly nonsense. So clearly not something Seneca would have ever had said, even if he was just perhaps joking around, because it's so foreign to his mindset. As always, I will close by stressing that I think we have an obligation, if we're going to throw quotes around, to actually check to see whether those quotes can be sourced. You should be suspicious of people who in social media or on websites or videos or podcasts or even books these days are quoting Seneca or other authors without saying where the passage is coming from. If you don't know whether a quote is fake or real, you probably shouldn't be reposting it yourself because you're just contributing to the problem then. And, you should demand sources. It's perfectly fine to say where in Seneca's or whoever else's works did this come from. And I've got two sites I'd like to recommend to you, Sententiae Antiquae and Quote Investigator, both of which are quite useful for ferreting out and discussing the provenance, if we do know it, of the many fake quotes that circulate around.